Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Robbie Rhino, and in today's video I have a tank guide for you to the M103A2, which is a Western Alliance Era 2 heavy tank, and you get to this tank via the M103A1, which is a pretty good heavy tank in Era 1, and it leads onto the M60A1. This is the heavy route towards the M60A1. You can go the medium route, which is via the M47, the M48A5P1 and the M60, but a lot of people will decide to go down this heavy route just because it gets there without having to play, 6 mediums in order to progress to the rest of the line. And of course this line does eventually lead to the M1A2 Abrams right at the end, so it can be a little bit of a tough tank to play in, a little bit of a tough grind, as we're going to see in today's video why that is. And I've got the stats here of the M103A2 in Excel here on the left, and we're going to be comparing to two other vehicles in this particular video. We're going to compare to the FV214 Conqueror Mark 1, plays a similar hold down play style with a little bit of armor but not too much, and I'm going to also compare to the T72 Ural, which is a Eastern Alliance Era 2 premium tank that a lot of players will have, and it's a heavy tank that's pretty poor in comparison, so it's going to be interesting to see how the stats of the M103A2 holds up to that vehicle as well. If you haven't seen my videos before, and the colour coding goes as follows: green is the best stat, red is the worst, and orange is somewhere in between, and the figures highlighted in yellow are with my command and equipment setup applied to the base stats of this vehicle when I talk you through my setup in just a little bit. I'll also talk you through the armor profile of the M103A2. We'll go into the garage and have a look at the armor viewer, and then we'll get stuck into 3 gameplays to see how this heavy tank performs on the battlefield. So right up first, hit points wise, you have 2,700 hit points, which is much more than the premium T72, but not quite as good as the Conqueror Mark 1. You have enough to take a few shots from sort of 105 to 120mm caliber guns, but you do have some 183mm caliber guns in Era 2, and you also have, of course, now have to contend with ATGMs. So yeah, your hit points don't last too long when you are pretty massive, easily detectable, even when you're not spotted with the True Vision system, and yeah, your armor doesn't always hold up, so you want to try and make the most of those hit points. In terms of your view range, 490 meters, not quite as good as the Conqueror Mark 1, but again better than the T72 Ural. This is allowing you to sort of spot for yourself enough that you can detect some other heavy tanks, but you're not going to be outspotting anything, and that is not your role on the battlefield anyway. In terms of your mobility, you have a 908 horsepower engine, which translates into a 15.61 power to weight ratio, 53.1 kilometers an hour forwards, 25.7 kilometers an hour in reverse, and your hull and your turret traverse are 34 degrees a second each. So in terms of your mobility compared to the other vehicles in this comparison, you have a better engine than the T72, not quite as good as the Conqueror. You do have a better power to weight than the Conqueror, so you're going to get up to your top forward speed a little bit quicker and be slightly better uphill, but you're not going to be as fast as something like an Eastern Alliance heavy tank like the T72 Ural. Much better power to weight and much better top forward speed. They're going to be running rings around you, getting into positions faster than you, and they're even going to be trying to circle you some of the faster heavy tanks in Era 2, but it's not the end of the world, and you can improve it with mobility equipment if you so wish. One nice thing about the M103A2's mobility is a pretty decent reverse speed, same as the Conqueror, much better than the T72 Ural, which allows you to get down off of those ridge lines faster and give your enemies or your opponents less of your heavy tank to shoot at. Hull traverse is very slow, the worst in this comparison, so you're going to want to try and improve that with things like mobility equipment, the traction system, and clutch braking on your commander. And your turret traverse, although it's pretty slow, not quite the slowest in the comparison, that goes to the T72 Ural again. But with gun handling skills, you can get it up to a pretty decent level, and that will allow you to swing your turret around at people that are trying to circle strafe you. But definitely be warned, with your poor hull and poor turret traverse, fast light tanks will deploy and get around you, especially with autoloaders and ATGMs, and you have to be ready for when they do. Move your turret and your hull at the same time, because if you don't, you will never be able to catch up with them. Back up into hard cover so that they can't continuously circle around you, because you are a pretty slow lumbering beast. In terms of your gun then, the M103A2 has a 120mm caliber gun, as does the Conqueror Mark 1, and the Ural in this comparison has a 125mm, so bear that in mind when we are talking about the alpha damages and the rest of the stats on this gun. So the M103A2, on its 120mm caliber gun, you have 3 flavours of ammunition: AP as standard, Heat as premium ammunition, and HE as your third ammunition selection. Your standard and premium rounds go for 530 damage each, and with your HE rounds 680, and your penetration is 366mm on your standard AP, and 380mm if you choose to use the Heat, and if you choose to use the HE, a pretty respectable 120mm, and you definitely can make that work against some of the lightly armoured targets. And speed-wise, 1067 meters a second on your standard rounds, slightly higher at 1143 meters a second on your premium Heat, and much lower at 762 meters a second on your HE round. So when we're going to compare it to the Conqueror's 120mm caliber gun, you can see that you do have 20 more alpha damage on your HE and on your standard and premium rounds compared to the 510 and 660 on the Conqueror Mark 1. However, you can see that your penetration is the worst in this comparison, even worse than the T72 Ural. This is absolutely terrible penetration for Era 2, and it really struggles, especially against things like the FE4-11, and even against another M103A2, it can struggle to pen some of the armour. The jump to 380th and 366 from your standard to your premium Heat rounds, it's not worth it in my opinion, and Heat is notoriously difficult to use in Era 2 because of all the composite armour, all of that spaced armour protecting against Heat, ATGMs and HE. I don't carry any Heat with this tank at all. You might want to carry a few. It's got slightly better shell velocity, but even that's not a massive improvement, and I just do not think it's worth it, especially for the cost. However, I do recommend carrying some HE rounds, although the shell velocity, you know, is half less than the standard and your premium rounds. If you can make them work with 120mm a pen, it jumps up your alpha damage and your DPM, and it can work against some of the lightly armoured sort of tank destroyers and light tanks. But overall, when you look at this gun compared to the other guns on the other two tanks, you can see that you have a much worse shell velocity than something like the Ural, which has 1800 meters a second. So you're going to have to give a lot of lead with your standard rounds on this vehicle, and they do feel very slow in the air. It's okay for sniping at short to mid ranges, but longer ranges you can struggle. You might want to think about Heat because it carries penetration over distance and doesn't lose any at all, and you do have that slightly better shell velocity, but it's hard to use the Heat rounds, and for that slight jump in pen and damage, slight pen, not damage, it's the same damage, yeah, it's just not worth it in my opinion. And your HE rounds you can make work, but again, give double the amount of lead that you would with your standard rounds. But yeah, the other tanks in this comparison have much better penetration. You can see the Conqueror Mark 1 with 408 on its standard and 452 with premium APDS, which in my opinion is far superior, especially in Eras 2 and 3. And yeah, you can even see that the HE rounds on the T72 Ural, because of the slightly higher caliber, slightly higher alpha damage on all three of its rounds, great shell velocity on its standard and HE rounds, and yeah, slightly higher penetration on its HE rounds as well. So you have the worst gun in this comparison by some way from just looking at those stats. But how about the gun handling then and DPM? Well, you have the joint worst aim time at 2.1 seconds, joint with the Ural, not as good as the Conqueror Mark 1, and you have a pretty respectable accuracy for a 120mm, not as good as the Conqueror, but much better than the T72 Ural, meaning that if you wanted, you can sacrifice some gun handling on your commander and your equipment setup to improve other areas of this tank. In terms of your DPM, 3615, which means you reload for one shell in 8.8 seconds. This DPM is, yeah, much higher than the T72, but not quite as good as the Conqueror Mark 1, but it's still a pretty decent DPM. It's just very hard to use this gun because of the penetration and that shell velocity, but if you can make it work, the DPM is pretty respectable for an entry-level heavy tank. In terms of ammo capacity, 50 rounds, the same as the Conqueror, more than the T72, and you have the same 10 degrees of gun depression and 15 degrees of gun elevation as on the Conqueror Mark I, which allows you to work many different ridge lines, and it's much better than an Eastern Alliance heavy tank like the T72 Ural. So a little bit of a mixed bag with the M103A2. Mobility is just about good enough to get into position. It does struggle with things circle strafing it. The reverse speed is nice, but apart from that, it's very, very mediocre to poor. Enough hit points for an entry-level Era 2 heavy tank, enough view range. You have a pretty nice alpha damage, but extremely bad penetration, apart from some pretty usable HE rounds. Slow shell velocity should give plenty of lead. Gun handling isn't too bad, and you can get it down to a nice level, and the DPM, when you can make that pen work, isn't too bad at all, and good gun depression and elevation and ammo capacity. Just quickly, let's see what has changed from the M103A1 in Era 1 to the M103A2, then we'll get talking about my commander and equipment setup. So, in terms of your hit points, as you've gone up in Era, you have a 500 jump in your hit points to 2,700, and a nice jump in your view range from 445 to 490 meters. You have the same 908 horsepower engine, however you have a slightly slower power to weight. I'm guessing you are just slightly heavier than the M103A1. In terms of your top forward speed and reverse speed, however, that's gone up by a substantial margin. The same poor hull traverse and your turret traverse has improved. With the 120mm caliber gun, the same shell velocity. You do have better penetration, but when you compare it to all the other heavy tanks in Era 2, it still is extremely poor, and your alpha damage has jumped up on all 3 of the rounds, as you can see, from 450 to 530 on the standard and premium, and 580 to 680 on the HE rounds. In terms of your aim time, you've actually lost 0.1 second aim time over the Era 1 heavy tank, but you've gained 0.06 accuracy, so you are much more accurate. DPM has gone up by quite a long way, and you have 5 more rounds with the same 10 degrees of gun depression and 15 degrees of gun elevation. So enough changes to make it work in Era 2 just about, but it is extremely difficult to play, as I'll talk about in the gameplay at the end. But I'll quickly talk to you now about my commander and equipment setup on the M103A2 and how that's affected the stats of this tank. So in terms of equipment, what I like to run is the advanced loader, the improved ventilation and the traction system. And in terms of my commander skills, 6th Sense, Born Leader, Rapid Loading, Steady Aim, Rapid Aim, Snapshot, Run and Gun, Armor Angling and Track Mechanic. In terms of consumables, Large Med, Large Repair Kit, and I'm using the Enhanced Hull Patch Kit on this vehicle, which is something I don't often use, but it does instantly repair, not instantly repair, I'm talking about the repair kit. The Enhanced Hull Patch Kit, it's minus 5% to module damage, and it does restore 5% of your HP over 20 seconds. And I just felt like it was useful on this vehicle. You could use the combat rations to improve DPM and your gun handling and all of that kind of good stuff. But I felt like it was necessary on this vehicle, and it worked well for me. In terms of my equipment, loader and ventilation to help the DPM gun handling out, and also traction system to help with the whole traverse, and also help with the max speed by 10% to both of those, and yeah, of course, improving the top, forward and reverse speed by a little bit as well. And in terms of my commander skills, 6th Sense and Born Leader is standard, rapid loading to help the DPM. I've gone for 4 gun handling skills. You might want to take out Run and Gun and use something like Clutch Braking to help the whole traverse, or Off-Road Driving to help the mobility. Armor Angling, just reducing the damage by 5%. And Track Mechanic, getting my tracks on 25% faster is a must in this vehicle, because you are so large, your armor isn't always going to work, and yeah, you are a massive target with pretty poor mobility. So what has that done to the base stats of this vehicle? In terms of my view range, it's buffed it to 521 meters, so nothing to shout about there. In terms of the mobility, because of the traction system and also because of the gun handling skills, my hull traverse has gone up to 37.4 degrees a second, and turret traverse has gone up because of the gun handling skills to 40.36 degrees a second, so I can get my gun and hull round now at tanks that are trying to circle me. Reverse speed gone up by a little bit more to 28.27, which is good for getting off of those ridge lines, and the forward speed, getting into position, using that 15.61 power to weight. It's gone up to 58.41 kilometers an hour forward, so a nice little boost there to the mobility. And lastly, in terms of the gun handling and DPM, aim times dropped from 2.1 to 1.97 seconds, accuracy down to 0.24, which is very nice indeed, and a big jump in DPM. We now reload for one shell in 6.58 seconds, and a DPM of 4,828, which is actually pretty good for an entry-level Era 2 heavy tank. You've just got to try and make use of that god-awful penetration on your standard and premium rounds, and also the poor shell velocity as well. So that's it for my commander and equipment setup and how it's changed the vehicle. We're now going to head on over into the garage, have a look at the armor profile of the M103A2, and then we're going to get stuck into the first of 3 gameplays. So I'll see you over in the garage in just a second. So we are in the garage and we are now having a look at the armor viewer of the M103A2. We're going to go from the thickest parts of the armor down to the thinnest parts of the armor and see how the armor holds up on this vehicle. So the front of the turret is 254mm here. This is the exact same as the Era 1 M103A1, so very disappointing. The mantlet has some spaced armor, so heat is going to struggle to go through it and will probably be absorbed, but anything with decent penetration should go straight through the front of this turret. There's angling, as you can see on this turret, it's very well rounded. However, depending on where you were shooting at it from, so if you're shooting at it from the side, those rounded parts become flatter and it's an easy penetration. When you're using your 10 degrees of gun depression, moving around on a ridgeline, you can get some ricochets off the turret, but anything with decent penetration has a great chance of going through, and even under the mantlet there, 254mm can go through very easily. You have this mid bar here which connects your boat-shaped lower plate and boat-shaped upper hull, 241mm. It's a slight improvement on the 228mm this section had on the Era 1 vehicle. However, anything with decent penetration, again, can just go straight through it. At an angle like sort of 40 to 45 degrees, sometimes you can get miracle ricochets. However, 80 GMs and anything's just going to laugh at this and probably go straight through and absolutely ruin your day. So a very big hole, and you want to try and hide it as much as possible. Section there underneath sort of the mantlet and just before the turret ring, 228, again not very good for an Era 2 heavy tank. You have this section here on the upper plate, 215mm, which is sort of rounded upwards, but not by a long way, and that's again an easy penetration. And the front of the mantlet, 215mm, so a little bit of spaced armor in that mantlet to help against heat. However, decent pen can just go straight through the front of this turret. You have a giant weak spot on the M103A2 in the form of the cupola, the same as the M103A1. The cupola on the M103A2 is slightly stronger than the Era 1's 152mm, but this is an easy penetration, and even when you're using your 10 degrees of gun depression, quite an easy target. So try and move around as much as possible on a ridgeline and try and get people to miss your cupola, because it is a massive glaring weak spot. 171mm of a sort of side mantlet and also side cheek armor on the turret, and it's well angled, so at angles like this, when you're shooting up at it and you're shooting it not at a flat angle, you can ricochet off the front of this turret. If you just go underneath the gun, try and shoot the cupola, you have a much better chance of going through. And only 171mm, not great even for an entry level sort of Era 2 heavy tank. Your lower plate is 165mm. It's better than the 152mm on the M103A1, but again, it's very, very large, not very well angled at all, and a massive weak spot with no spaced armor, very easy to go through. And this section above the mantlet, it can't be overmatched, which is good news, but it's only 165mm. When you're using your full extent of your gun depression, it kind of almost becomes kind of flatter the more that this tank peaks over a ridgeline sometimes. However, if it's kind of rocking backwards and forwards like this, you can hit it on an upslope at a steeper angle and ricochet. But yeah, again, the higher you are, the easier you are going to be able to go through this section. middle of the upper plate 152mm, and then the top part of the upper plate is angled sort of down to the left and down to the right, as you can see inside the hole, 139mm. This section here, I believe, is slightly better than the 127mm that was on the M103A1, but again, not great at extreme angles, occasional ricochets, but for the most part, people are just going to go straight through this. Other sections on the turret, which doesn't really matter. All you need to know is you can just go straight through the side when it's flat. When it's using its gun depression on a ridge, try and hit the flattest part to you, or underneath the gun, or hit that massive cupola. The side armor is the same as the M103A1, which is a bit disappointed, although it isn't too bad. You've got 63mm of side armor over the front here, then you've got 59mm of side armor just beyond that. You've got side armor above the tracks the whole way along at 50.8mm, and then you have 44mm at the rear of the side, and that's also the rear of the tank as well. So you can side scrape pretty well. The only thing that can overmatch you really is a 183mm caliber gun, like on the Rock Crawler, so definitely be wary of that. And if you're shooting at this with a 183mm caliber gun, just miss that front 63mm section here, and yeah, you should be able to overmatch the whole of the side of this vehicle. But it does well against 105, 120mm and 125mm caliber guns, so that is good news for the M103A2. You can side scrape pretty well, however, if you over angle, you can just go straight through the drive rail into the upper hole, and yeah, it's not going to be good news for the M103A2. The rest of the armour is a little bit of kind of spacing on the side and the kind of engine deck there, but for the most part this vehicle is disappointing, but to be expected as an entry level heavy tank in Era 2. Some space there over the tracks at 15mm, but what's the take home if you're shooting this thing and you've got decent penetration? I'm talking kind of 400mm, maybe even slightly less than that. You can go through the upper plate, lower plate quite easily, and the front of the turret. Avoid shooting the angled parts of the turret, go for the cupola when it's using its gun depression, and if you're playing this thing, side scrape where possible, but don't over angle. Advance your enemies moving sort of 40 degrees to the left and right, and advance them quickly. Try and get them to bait into your tracks or to an extreme angle, and when you're on a ridgeline, use your 10 degrees of gun depression, try and bait people into shooting the sides, and trying to cover your cupola with your gun by holding it in front of the cupola like that. And yeah, use your good reverse speed on a ridgeline, stay hull down and try and expose as little of your upper hull as possible, but don't rely on the armour to bounce. And that's it for the armour viewer there of the M103A2. We're now going to get stuck into the first of 3 gameplays. So we are into the first gameplay of today's video, and we are here on Heilbronn in the M103A2. It's an encounter battle, and we've made our way into F5 here on this ridgeline, trying to make use of the 10 degrees of gun depression and see if we can shoot anyone in the middle of this map. On Heilbronn, where does everyone usually go on your team when you spawn? In the north, they sit in that camping position over in B8, and they stay there for most of the game. So we're trying to put the view range to work on this vehicle. You can see that we're going to be outspotted when we poke this ridge, so we do have to be quite careful. And whenever I'm reloaded, I'm just popping up, see if I can get some vision, see if I can get a shot. I'm trying not to wait around too long on the ridgeline, because you are a very large profile tank in the M103A2 and easy to spot. Even when you're not actually spotted with the spotting mechanics, you are a very large profile and easy to spot on a ridgeline. However, with the decent reverse speed that we've buffed with the traction system, we can get down off of these ridgelines nice and quickly, and you can see that the DPM isn't actually too bad on this vehicle. Mine's now 4,828 with my setup, and as an entry-level Era 2 heavy tank, it isn't too bad and you can make it work. It just struggles when people all in you, and if you're in a battle of DPMs, you'll usually come out on the bottom. That's unless they aren't a very good player and they bounce off of your armour, so you have to try and make use of what you have with the M103A2. So a little bit of turret armour when you're hull down, and yeah, side scraping, trying to bait people into shooting steep angles on your upper hull. We've picked up 2.7k damage, or basically 2.8k damage here in this position. This 30B is poking over, and when tanks come at you in this location, it can either go one of two ways. Either they'll come over and they'll get obliterated by all of the tanks that are hopefully supporting you when they're camping behind you in the north, or they're just going to all in you. Your teammates aren't going to help you and you're going to be a little bit stuck. But I didn't want to just sit and sort of snipe at the back, because this tank is terrible at sniping thanks to the very poor penetration and also the poor shell velocity. So you want to get sort of mid-range, support some of your stronger heavy tanks, and do work like we're doing here on a ridgeline. Just being that support tank, you've got a healthy slug of hit points, and you've got a little bit of armour to sometimes try and make work. This 50B comes round, 30B I should say. I've been playing too much of the World War II game mode, obviously. He actually manages to put a shot into our tracks, which maybe it was heat and it got absorbed, and that allows us to get the reload on him, and we take out that AMX 30B for our second kill of today's video. And yeah, I'm just trying to play a support style, not overly aggressive, just supporting what vision we have. Don't want to be overly aggressive, because that's when you lose all of your hit points. And yeah, be very wary of faster tanks and tanks with 80 GMs that are shooting at you, because your armor is poor for Era 2. Yeah, you can get penetrated by 80 GMs, and it isn't good news. Make use of your nice alpha damage at 530 with your standard and premium, and 680 if you manage to pen with the HE. And as you can see, I don't carry any heat, just standard AP and 5 of those HE in case I come up against lightly armoured targets or I need to splash something. Because of the poor penetration, you might want to consider taking like 10 HE. If you really struggle to find weak spots on things like the FV4-11, use your higher caliber 120mm caliber gun, use the HE damage and splash tanks if you can't penetrate. But that's if, of course, you are really struggling with the penetration, and it can be a little bit of an issue. At this kind of distance here though, you can see we've got plenty of hit points saved up, and we can just go all in, try and get the remaining bits of damage in this game. And with your high alpha damage, it doesn't take too long for you to rack up the damage in the M103A2. It's nothing spectacular. It is a bit of a tough grind, but it's not the worst grind in Era 2. And yeah, when you get to the M60A1, yeah, then you can start looking forward to some of the more exciting tanks in this line on the way to the M1A2 Abrams. So we are capturing the base. There's 2 enemy tanks remaining. The light tank is spotted to my left, an armadillo, so that'll be very hard to hit with the poor shell velocity on the M1A3A2. But we're going to go after this tank destroyer. I believe it's a rock crawler, so he can overmatch the side of my tank, apart from the very first section, which is 63mm. So I do have to be a little bit careful, but we've got enough, unless he ammo racks me or sets me on fire, to take a shell, even a Hesh round, so we should be golden. This armadillo looks like he's going to be flanking round, so we're just going to prepare for him to come up behind us, and I'm just hoping we can finally figure out where this tank destroyer is to get the last remaining little bit of damage in this game. We have block 2070, which is actually quite surprising for this vehicle. It doesn't usually block an awful lot for me. However, you can see when you're putting yourself in the right positions and you're kind of moving around on a ridgeline, you're moving at your enemies when they're advancing at you, you can get some nice ricochets off this kind of boat-shaped hull, which yeah, it can surprise you actually with how much you can block in certain games. But in that game there on Heilbronn, we finished with a profit with or without a premium account, 1.4k base XP, 2 kills, 6.3k direct damage, no assistance and 2k blocked. And that's it for the first gameplay there. We are now going to head on into the second gameplay, and I'll see you over there. So we are now into the second gameplay of today's video, and we are here on Mountain Pass in the M103A2. We've spawned in the southeast, and I'm going to make my way as quickly as this tank allows into position, maybe to catch some tanks out that are trying to go through the centre of the map. I don't think I've got the mobility to cross the gap and get over to the southwest. I'll make that decision en route, and yeah, there's already a lot of tanks spotted over there in E2, E3. So we're going to go up to this edge of this rock here and just peek round with the free camera there first to see if we can see anything hiding in the bushes. I'm angled at kind of 40 degrees here, maybe slightly less than that. and we managed to get a shot for 503 damage into that AMX. We have to be very careful here of sneaky tanks, and yeah, tanks with 80 GMs that are hiding in the bushes at the back there, but I'm going to angle as best as possible, trying to make the most of this boat-shaped hole, and it's not the best when people are firing at you dead on, but if you're clever with your angling, as you saw for the armor profile in the review earlier, you can bounce some shells off this tank. It's just not reliable, but then for an entry-level Era 2 heavy tank, yeah, I'm not expecting it to be anything like an FE4-211. It's just good enough. We went for the track there on that TR-125, and we are getting some nice juicy rewards. Going to go for the retracking shot there, and hopefully we can get all of the juicy assistance, as, yeah, that tank hasn't got any gun depression. We do. We can sit here with immunity, and we can keep retracking him, and hopefully he'll get taken out eventually. And yeah, we put a nice shot through there, and the FE4-211 finishes him off. So that's a good way of getting through your grinds quickly. Get that tracking assistance in tanks like this that can't really outspot tanks, but track them in positions for your allies, play that support role, keep them in position. Like if that was a tank that I couldn't penetrate, like maybe an FE4-211, I'd struggle to penetrate it, but I could keep it tracked there for my tanks that are able to actually penetrate it, and that's a way of getting some nice juicy assistance. Playing a bit of a risky game here, going down into the dip, but we do manage to get a nice shot that sets that Chieftain 120 on fire. If it was a one-on-one in terms of DPM and it was just us two, the 120 should beat us hands down every time because of the penetration and because of the DPM difference. However, we had the jump on him, and because we have a fairly high alpha damage gun and a 120mm caliber gun, our module damage 180, you are a little bit more likely to deal things like critical damage, fires like that, so it is quite nice to have this alpha damage. And yeah, I've just now noticed that our base is under threat, so hopefully we can make it there in time. You can get a nice idea in this particular gameplay of the mobility of the M103A2. Unfortunately, the WZ-122 there was above us and did fire an 80 GM, but we managed to just escape it, and we can make our way back to the base. And you can see here that it's not the slowest tank in Era 2, but it's definitely not the quickest, and it can be quite frustrating. I don't think it's worth putting the advanced powertrain on as well, because I think it's worth improving other aspects of this tank, like the gun handling and the DPM, because they are a couple of the only kind of redeeming features that make this a decent enough tank in Era 2 alongside the alpha damage. But now we're going to come up against the FE4-211, going to track him for the reset there, and unfortunately we're in a bit of a difficult situation. We have 10 degrees of gun depression, but it's not quite enough to come over and just expose our turret, so we went for the retrack there, and now we're going to try and side scrape. And with this boat shaped hole, this is something that this tank can do very well against a tank like an FE4-211. It hasn't got a high enough caliber to overmatch, and he has just ignored us as he's taking fire from behind. So he's turned, and now's our chance to go forward and see if we can get some penetrating shells on this FE4-211. If we did load heat, we could probably go through the cupola, and we could probably go through even with the AP occasionally, but it's not every time, and this is when this tank struggles. But the FE4-211 over angles, and we go through his drive wheel, and yeah, we managed to take out one of the most OP Era 2 heavy tanks with our M103A2 there, picking up 1 kill, 3.9k direct damage, 2.5k assistance. We managed to block some damage in that game, and 1.3k base XP. We blocked 970 damage, and that was the game where I think I finally unlocked the M60A1. Another profit with or without a premium account, because we don't fire any premium with this vehicle. And yeah, I think this is a pretty good indication of an average game you can expect when you get used to this vehicle. A reasonable amount of damage, some good assistance, and you block the occasional round, and it's, yeah, good enough to get through the grind. 4 minutes 24 second battle there on Mountain Pass, and a pretty decent result with 6.4k combined. And now we're going to head on into the third and final gameplay of today's video. So we are now into the third and final gameplay of today's video, and we're here on Erlenberg in the M103A2. We've spawned in the south, and I'm going to make my way down the 9-0 line and see if we can get some shots at tanks that are pushing towards the north, and also some shots across the map. We're going to line one up there on the move, blind fire at that tank that was crossing across the other side of the map, and we actually managed to hit it. RNG was in our favour there, and that was a very, very unlikely shot to hit because of the very slow shell velocity that the AP rounds have at 1067 meters a second. So when you get used to leading your targets, you can kind of know roughly how much lead to give, even across maps like Erlenberg, relatively large maps, and you can do some pretty gnarly shots. It just takes a little bit of practice, and when you play a lot of vehicles in Cold War, especially eras 2 and 3, they have such good shell velocity. You can sort of drop back to a vehicle that doesn't have good shell velocity, and you can struggle for a little while until you adjust. But when you get used to it at mid ranges, it's not too bad. It's just at those long ranges it can become a little bit tricky. So we've now got up to 1k damage and 224 assistance in this particular battle. We get another shot there into the M60A1, which this tank leads onto, and yeah, I just realised there was a random Leopard 1A1 to our right. Don't know why he came around so far. I should have realised that sooner, and yeah, we don't manage to pick up any damage on that vehicle. I think we missed that shot there. We just fired on the M60A1 because of the shell velocity. I think we just didn't sort of snap it in. I didn't give enough lead even at this distance, and now we're trying to hit the cupola of that M60A1. Quite a difficult target to hit when he's moving on a ridgeline, especially again with this shell velocity, even at this distance, can be the difference between you hitting those weak spots and you not. And now we're trying to go for the cupola on the T72, and we managed to actually find it. And with the poor penetration on this vehicle, 366mm on its standard AP, that was a pretty lucky penetration at that kind of angle. But yeah, you miss every shot that you don't take, and then we go straight through the front of the T72's turret. And again, I think that's a pretty lucky penetration from what I remember the armor being like on that vehicle. And our third one tracks him in place and he repairs very quickly. And yeah, this is what you do in the M103A2. You get a ridgeline, you use the 10 degrees of gun depression, you try and expose as little of your hull as possible, and when you do, you angle it up and you try and bait people into shooting your tracks or off the sloped parts of your boat-shaped hull. And yeah, when you're on a ridgeline, move around as much as possible, try and put the gun in front of your cupola to make it a hard shot for your opponents to hit. And yeah, play the support heavy tank role. Don't get into engagements with tanks that have amazing DPM because they're going to rip you to shreds. And yeah, try and stay clear of things like FE4-11. Try and get them to turn for your opponents before you shoot them. And make sure you learn the weak spots of all of the enemy tanks that you come across, because you do have bad penetration. But yeah, if you're joining up with your teammates, that's when you can become quite effective. You can support them, track people in place, you can bounce the occasional shell for them, and yeah, you can just become a little bit of a nuisance. And I would recommend, if you have platoon mates, try grinding through this line or through this particular tank with a platoon mate to make it slightly easier, someone with a little bit more penetration and a little bit more reliable armor. And yeah, you can probably have some good games. We managed to put some nice shots there at that bandit who wasn't moving too much at that distance, so the shell velocity didn't really matter too much there. We're up by 6 tanks here, make that 7 tanks, so we're going to make the way forwards. We've preserved our hit points for long enough. We can go straight through the centre of this map. We have managed to block 550, and we've got another sort of reasonable amount of combined damage for the M103A2. When I started to grind through this heavy tank, I started to play it a little bit too aggressively, got frustrated, and then yeah, I was expecting too much of it because, again, like I've been saying throughout this whole video, it's an entry-level era 2 heavy tank. It's not many tanks like it in terms of its hit points and level. The only kind of worse in terms of stats, in most stats, is the T72 Ural, which we've seen at the start of today's video. That's a god-awful premium tank, and yeah, one most people have because it was one of the first ones released. But you can see here that I try to reverse up in front of the bandit. You're a pretty heavy tank, so if things do ram you, you can get some pretty tasty ram damage out of it, but you ramming other tanks can be difficult because your mobility isn't great. You can see the whole traverse here is quite slow, but we do do manage to swing the turret round. With the gun handling skills, they improve the turret traverse, and it's enough to get the gun round on tanks like this bandit that are chasing us. I think I gave a little bit too much lead there, and we just whiffed that shell, which would have been the killing blow. However, I'm going to go now for a ram on this bandit who looks like he's trying to drown himself, so if we touch him before he kills him, we're going to get the credit for the kill. And we managed to get there just in time for that kill there. And that ends this game on Erlenberg. So we finished MVP in that game. Didn't have to do an awful lot for it, but a good profit with or without a premium account. Confederate Medal First Class, 1.3k base XP, 1 kill, 5.8k direct damage. We weren't fully upgrading in this particular gameplay. We were still going for the tracks. 693 assistance. We blocked 550. Another example of what you can do if you're a patient, play support heavy tank gameplay, get on a ridgeline, and make the most of the aspects of your armour that are actually quite decent. But just be aware, it's not reliable, and tanks will just butter, especially if they're firing premium or they've got ATGM. So just be careful, use your map awareness, and yeah, support your heavy tank push. And I hope that you found today's video on the M103A2 informative and or enjoyable. If you just watched the gameplay, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for your support. We're getting very close to 2,000 subs, which is absolutely insane. So thank you all very much for that. And yeah, until next time, I'll see you on the battlefield, and bye for now.